Thank you. Thank you all for some fascinating insights to your research. Really interesting stuff. So we now have just over 15 minutes for questions from yourselves. So there are some roving mics. Please wait till the mic comes to you before asking a question. But any starters? Got a lady down here in the front and lots of questions. That's really good. We'll call you in. If we can start off with the lady in the yellow, please.
Thank you. Absolutely brilliant. Really, really enjoyed listening to all of those presentations, so thank you. I think this is Chris, if I remembered your name correctly. Apologies. No, next person along. Sorry. The process, the process is hub. We are in the right in the middle of a project where we are working with about 20 local authorities to help them circumnavigate some issues related to free school meal registrations, whereby at the moment it's reliant on parents and families to apply. This is actually going really well, and the local authorities are really happy because not only are we encouraging thousands of families to get free school meals, they're also getting funding from it. However, there is still some pushback. And so my question really is about the work that you're doing in terms of the political will of some of the things that you're discovering and what you're doing perhaps to overcome some of the barriers associated with changing these processes.
Sure. Shall I say that straight away?
Please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So when you look at public services, any public service operates ultimately in a political context and an economic context. And it is true that there are certain systems where it's more amenable to doing this kind of work. So, I mean, if you take the Hubs Ukraine study, it's a really good example. It's quite difficult to do this work in some areas of immigration processes where it almost feels like there might be deliberately difficult processes, where for the Hubs Ukraine study, there was a huge amount of political will in that context to get those processes right. And that dynamic applies broadly. As far as we can see, and it's sort of, that might be in local politics or national politics, and we always have to be sensitive to those factors. The thing that I would say, though, is that in doing more and more of this work in different contexts, is often, you know, what you find in systems that many people might consider to be poorly designed or failing, is behind them there's usually a group of officials or servants or whoever it might be who are genuinely trying to do the best with what they've got. And often it's about misunderstanding the needs of different groups and the priorities of different groups. So, you know, to go back to the universal credit example I talked about, when I said, you know, the Department for Work and Pensions really emphasising speed, you know, we want to get people their benefits as quickly as possible, you know, that's really well intentioned, but it might be that they're just underestimating the importance of slightly softer, we might call them softer factors, such as the way that people are spoken to. It's a complex question. I'm happy to chat more after as well, but it's definitely something that we have to work around, but also try to sort of work with as well.
Thanks. Question for the man on the end of the aisle up there, please.
Cheers. It's a question for Chris, so apologies to the other three panellists, it's a bit specific. The sort of key distinction you made in your talk between victims and offenders, and obviously a huge grey area perhaps in the middle of all of that. Do you see any parallels that's applying to sort of effectively you're talking about drug dealers, but also drug users, if you like, the client base of the people who've become involved in company lines drug dealing? Are there any parallels there? I'm thinking perhaps of recent Scottish government trials, you know, drug consumption rooms, for example, up in Scotland, bring to the fore this distinction between, you know, offenders and victims. It's a kind of new approach, a new view, where it's treating the drug users in a kind of more medico-health way rather than as criminals, frankly. But of course, if you take an illegal drug, in the eyes of the law, you're automatically a criminal, aren't you? I mean, presumably, police could walk into any one of these drug consumption rooms and arrest everybody, because what they're doing in there is illegal. But the Scottish government has made a decision not to view it in that way. Yeah. So I'm not sure if there's a question in there.
No, I understand your point. I mean, it was a really interesting question. So I think one of the things I'll refer back to is when we were conducting phase 2 of our research, where we went into specific areas for a short period of time. Two of my colleagues spent time shadowing police officers when they were looking at county lines intensification weeks, where they would particularly try to crack down on county lines. And large parts of those weeks were actually spent going around taking drugs off drug users and arresting drug users. So I would say actually in terms of the research, the work that we're doing, what we're seeing on the ground, the distinction, there is still a very clear distinction, and the police are still cracking down on drug users in the same way they would have done previously. So we're not seeing a huge amount of progress in that direction, certainly in terms of our research.
Yeah, because obviously there are international differences as well. You can see around the world where different attitudes are being adopted in different countries, and
certainly
more legalization, and and these are normal countries like Uruguay, Portugal, United States.
Yeah, still a long way to go.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We had a lady down the front here. We'll come to you in a moment, but it's the lady at the front here.
Thank you. So this is a little bit related to the first question, but I wonder if more of you could perhaps chip in about the prospects and challenges in really delivering the impact, having understood the problem. Chris, you talked about the very disparate police services, and then the farming community is also very, very disparate. So how do you go about really effecting the change that you want to see?
Shall I start out? Okay, I mean, in terms of county lines, it's important to note that county lines is incredibly racialised. Whilst it's something we wasn't able to go into great detail in the presentation, but county lines is racialised. Young black men in particular are focused, and they're looked at as potential victims and criminals within county lines. So that's a very significant issue that we need to recognise and we need to address. And also in terms of county lines, we know that the areas most impacted by recruitment of young people into county lines, and the areas that are affected most in terms of drug distribution, are areas which have been experiencing high levels of poverty. We know there's been huge issues over the last 10, 15 years as a result of austerity. So first of all, we need to recognise that's taking place. And then I guess there's an element of pragmatism, in the sense that whilst recognising that we need to work with police forces in order for them to try to move in a more progressive way, whilst also recognising those issues. And I think us as researchers, we need to be really quite forthright in presenting those issues to policymakers when we are trying to deliver solutions.
Yeah, I guess in the context of my work, everything we do with partners. So we work with partners from the start. And sometimes that means things slow down because we have to build trust and confidence with partners. But that's worth it in our view. And it's not only worth it for the impact, it's worth it for the quality of the research. And particularly in terms of public services, the people that design public services will be seeing those services very differently to the way that we see them as external researchers and users of them. So it's really important for the quality of the research. In the longer term, we are very keen in the lab to try and break down the barriers between research and practice in terms of public service design. And we're trying lots of ways to do that. One of the ways I'm particularly keen is to have civil servants come and work with us at the lab and work on projects at the lab, and for members of our team to go and work in different government bodies. We're almost close to getting 3 senior civil servants to come and join us for a short while, and we want to start doing more of that work. I think that's a really important way of building trust and confidence, building shared understanding about what we're trying to add to the sort of general enterprise, and actually trying to secure that impact, because it is difficult to turn research into impact.
Matthew, do you want to come on?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, one of the things that would be important and continues to be is kind of encouraging a kind of cultural literacy. I think it's taken for granted that people simply understand one another, but the underpinnings of Western civilization are references to Hebrew and Greek, ancient Greek culture, and I think they're still popping up within popular music. You think of one of the recent examples, of rap artist Dave makes reference to Moses and the burning bush in one of his songs, and of course one can extract those references, but there's actually a context to them. I think encouraging some kind of literacy around that is going to be important going forward, especially because it keeps on popping up. So that's what I say.
Yeah, I was going to say from my perspective is a bit of what my two colleagues said, is a bit of building a relationship with the community, but also working in raising awareness and education of the food system in my case. We see that working with the communities that we are working at, the Red Tower, for example, community, so the crops that we produce are not usually crops that they have access to. We needed to work on then on raising awareness of how they could do that, how they could cook those crops, and how they could incorporate on their diet those as well. So it's just one of the examples. We've worked at simple recipe card challenge with them, giving produce for free and asking people to do to write down the recipes that they were cooking at home for a month, and they have, once we give them the produce every week, we give them a set of recipe cards so they know easily what to do with those cards. It's just one example of how to work with those.
I'll just offer a comment from a sort of corporate perspective, because I think a lot of what we're talking about is increasingly a discourse happening, I think, in the policy world about, how does the public and private work together? And I think you sort of go through cycles where you get very sort of dictatorial governments, big state, perhaps more left-leaning governments, and you get more right-leaning governments that are about small states. You get governments like we have today that talk about a small state, but really a big state. But I think we're at a point, actually, current inflection, where people are quite interested in how does the private and public work together in different ways. And a lot of the discussions today sort of raise that point. I think particularly the processed pain one is not one that we're immune from. So Aviva is a big insurer. We create a lot of processed pain because we have a lot of regulatory things that we need to tell people when they ring us up. So you get on the phone and you hear 5 minutes of someone telling you a bunch of things that sound like disclaimers. Now, one answer to that is to argue for regulation to go away. That's not going to happen, and we wouldn't argue for that anyway because they're important things. But we do face similar challenges, and I do think there's a lot of scope to work together to think about how we overcome those and how we lean into these challenges of the future. The gentleman at the far back there.
Thanks very much. Those presentations were fantastic, and I've got questions for all of you, but I'll email them in. My one question for now is for Chris. You mentioned in your presentation that while gangs can be very networked, police services are often not so networked. And as a layman, that strikes me as being a key problem, but it would need some sort of governmental input to fix that. And I wondered, given the elected officials and governments often aren't very comfortable as presenting anyone that's involved with any criminal activity as a victim, because it might not run well in the media, I wondered how you feel your research is being received at a governmental level and whether you see this as the next challenge for you, really.
I think the research has been received fairly well. To be fair, I think one of the things we're benefiting from is, in fact, as I spoke about this in the presentation, is that we are largely talking about young people. Presenting young people as victims is an easier sell, quote unquote, than if you were to say selling someone who's 30, 35 as a victim. So I think in terms of a buy-in from the police and for police, certainly the Home Office and from the government, I think the buy-in's been fairly good. They are perceptive, and I think there certainly is scope for change. But as to how much change can be achieved, obviously that's where we're working with partners as a research centre to try and push those things forward. But I think certainly there's certainly scope for us, and that's what we're going to be looking forward in the long term.
Lady in the green in the middle here, please.
Thank you all for your talks. My question is for Joe and Chris, I believe. And I was wondering about if you've done any linguistic analysis on how the public are spoken about, how they're referred to within documentation and training, and also on in your interviews, if you've done any analysis about how they're spoken to, because you both touched on like the humanity behind these systems and how sometimes that's lacking. And in some of your quotes, like the language of the one officer clearly indicated an attitude. And I just wondered if you worked with language specialists to sort of break that down a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So we've not worked with language specialists yet, but it's something that's come out of our initial some of our initial studies. So we're very keen to do so. I guess one of the things that's really struck us as well is one of the outcomes we're interested in is whether people are willing to complain. So if you experience a bad service, how willing are you to complain? And the evidence we have on that is slightly counterintuitive, because rationally you might think if you have a really bad experience, you'd be more eager to complain. But the evidence we have suggests that if you have a really bad experience, you lose all trust in the system, and then you're actually less likely to complain. And one of the, so in terms of designing particularly digital interfaces, one of the issues in enabling people to complain and pursue and vindicate their rights and sort of secure entitlements that they should have access to is how much information you give people about their rights when they access public services. So if you see letters or screens when you're accessing public services, it might tell you a little information about how you can challenge that decision or where you can complain. And there's a huge debate in government about how much information should be put on letters, on interfaces, etc. And the framework in which that debate is happening is broadly about accessibility, which is super important, and about the idea that we shouldn't overburden people with too much information, etc. But we don't really know that actually it might be better to give people more information in some context. So what's the kind of rights empowering kind of approach to that? And we don't have clear answers to that. So linguistics are a really important part of it, and it's something that we're looking at quite closely for our next stage of our research.
Short answer is no, we've not looked at it in detail thus far. However, one of the things you mentioned was around training and kind of about perceptions. So we're looking at training quite closely in terms of our analysis, particularly around the way in which training is presented to police officers to help them identify and understand vulnerability. So it's something which we're looking at in that context. But I mean, to say that we're doing a linguistic analysis and we're getting linguistic experts in, that's not something that's on the horizon thus far, but maybe something to take on board for future projects for the centre.
I think this is very interesting in the context of your research, the question of linguistics in language, particularly when music doesn't necessarily use any of the words that may come from the gospel music, but potentially uses the rhythms or the chord progression. I mean, do you have a take on how it might apply in your context?
Without boring you, one of my main centres of interest, actually, I haven't been able to mention today, which is semiotics, being able to read music as sign. And I think that is one of the areas that requires a little bit of work in terms of translating musical outputs, especially gospel music, and understanding it properly within its context. So I'd say certainly there is room for people being able to read those signs properly and connect them actually to their original roots, because we're very good often at disconnecting things and just appropriating them without recognising exactly where they came from. So,
Alana, anything you want to offer on?
Not really, linguistics applied to vertical farming.
Thank you so much. We're out of time. The fact that we pushed to the end of time, I'm sorry, sir, we are out of time, but I'm sure that any of the colleagues here today would be happy to talk to you afterwards. But look, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. It's been really enjoyable to be part of this panel, to hear the amazing research that you're up to. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for your engagement. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conversations today, and enjoy the rest of York Talks.